Really good to be here. My name's Flo. I'm a football broadcaster and journalist working across the men's and women's game. I do a lot of work on podcasts and radio and TV, and someone that's seen women's football especially transform a lot over the last few years. So our session is going to be specifically around women's sport as a whole and storytelling and building heroes. And I've got a brilliant panel with me, so I'll intro them. Paul Morgan from Premiership Women's Rugby, someone who's been involved in rugby as a whole for a very long time. So Paul, great to have you with us. Then we've got Emily Defroand from West Ham in the comms team, and Edie Kelly from FA/Nuco. And lots of you in the room will probably know about Nuco, but if you don't, I'm sure Edie will give us a bit of insight into the brave new world that awaits women's football. So start with a really obvious question, guys, but who were your sporting heroes growing up? Paul, start with you.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, certainly they certainly played in the red and white of Manchester United, I imagine. Well, they definitely did. So I suppose it was that era, that 80s era of United, which was trophyless but very special. Olympic Games as well were obviously really, really important in our house as well. So I would have looked back at those. I suppose if we're looking for women in this very dark, distant days of Mary Peters, probably when I was very, very small, she would have been certainly someone I would have remembered and someone I'd have seen as a woman that I felt was a real role model for lots of certainly young boys and girls at that time.
Emily, how about yourself?
Yeah, sounds a little bit cringe, but my brothers. So I grew up in a household of 3 crazy sports-mad children, and my childhood, I just look back and my brothers played every sport under the sun, and every opportunity that we could. We were out in the garden, playing football, playing cricket, playing hockey, doing everything that we could around the sporting landscape. And I think my passion for sport kind of stemmed from them. But as Paul's alluded to, one of my earliest sporting experiences was the Olympic Games. I look back, I remember Kelly Holmes winning gold in 2004 in Athens. That was one of those moments where I can't really remember seeing many female athletes in the limelight at that point, and kind of seeing someone at the top of their game and kind of, excelling on the world stage. And it was something that kind of touched me and was like, wow, that's possible in sport.
Edie?
Yeah, you kind of stole my answer a little bit there in terms of my brother, but for a similar but different reason. I have a sister as well, and my brother always used to get my sister and I playing football in the garden. And I think for me, he used to love taking us to the park and challenging other groups of boys, and he used to love the fact that he had 2 sisters that could go up against everyone else. So for me, I just love that, he didn't really care that he had 2 little sisters. He just had 2 good footballers. And I think I really like that approach and taking it into what we do now and what I do now, because, yeah, I think for me, that when I look back, it was just so normal, and that's the way it should be going, and it is going.
Yeah, I think it's interesting reflecting on, obviously, a lot of our joint experience growing up, right, is my sporting idol. I'm a big QPR fan, so Sir Les Ferdinand was a big part of my sort of foundational years spotting QPR, and then Rachel Yankee was probably the most high-profile women's footballer around, and that was the only coverage that women's football really got was, occasional FA Cup finals and then some international games. So I feel like now we're going through a new generation of people that are watching women's sport, and it's going to be a lot of women's sport role models that are going to be inspiring and influencing them. Start with yourself, Edie, in terms of the storytelling that you do at the FA. How do you go about communicating the stories of the players? Obviously, the FA in an interesting position, and the Nuco comes into that, but obviously there's a certain role for the clubs to do in how they push the players and they push their storylines and they market their games. But because the FA have been running the sport, they also have had a role to play. So how have you guys navigated in that? And also, is there a way that you incorporate data as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think, when you come back to what a hero is, I think it's someone that you admire. There's something that they're doing that you really want and you really want to see more of. So ultimately, the biggest part of that is the performance element of the athletes. These people have to be really high-performing athletes, because that's what's admirable about that. And that's a bit of a difference between the men's and the women's game because everyone has known who these athletes are. You've got your Messis, you've got your Ronaldos, so everyone knows their talent, but no one really knows who the women's footballers are, and they are getting to know them a lot more now. And how they're doing that is through the personality, through the authenticity, and the accessibility to it as well. So there is obviously the performance side to it, where you have to show that these are high-performing athletes on the biggest stages, playing against the biggest players, but also showing their personalities a bit more, seeing what they're like down to down, what do they like getting into, put the 2 and 2 together, and I think that's what really makes some great content. They can see what they want to be, and they feel a connection to them as well.
Do you think we're seeing a shift, and we'll see that with the new era for women's football, of a massive focus on personality and story and a shift to focus on entertainment and sporting product? Because I think we have seen that culturally a little bit with every major tournament that's gone by. But I wonder, is that going to be a focus of that new era? Is, there is a very educated football audience, the panel just gone spoke a lot about that, who maybe there's a thirst to actually see more sporting discussion. Do you think that narrative's going to change coming up?
I think it will stay similar. I think that there might be some changes, but I think that there's other sports are kind of learning from us as well. And if you take the England teams, for example, I would say the content that the Lionesses produce over the summer that they won the Euros, by the way, so let's not forget that they were the champions of Europe, but also we saw an insight that no one had really seen before. So on their journey to the top, they were seeing the silly side to them, what they're like in camp. And that's purely down to the relationships that the social media team have with the players and allows them to do that. And from that, I'd say the England men's team then take learnings from that. And then they say, oh, okay, if we can do that on a women's side, it's not really affecting their sporting achievements. It's actually enhancing it because everyone feels a bit more relaxed about it.
Paul, Edie touched on it there about what other sports are learning from women's football, and I think there's a bit of maybe desperation's a harsh word, but everyone is looking at how well women's football's doing and saying, we want a piece of that. And obviously, women's rugby's in its own new era in terms of the rebrand of the league and everything. So is there anything that you guys have particularly looked at as what's worked so much for the WSL and the Lionesses, and you think, okay, how can we apply that? I went to the Six Nations game last summer where the Sugar Babes performed, iconic Twickenham moment, and that was obviously a very specific kind of risk in a way, a bit of a roll the dice to do something different. But what are some of the other things that women's rugby is looking at to maybe lean on women's football a bit?
I mean, you'd always want to look at football, wouldn't you, and what it's doing, but you can sometimes in a challenger sport, which rugby is, compare yourself badly to them as well. So there's a bit of both, isn't there? A bit of, going with your own path, but also looking to other sports. But we'd look to netball and the NFL and the NBA as well. So we'd look to them all. But I think, as you said, one thing I wanted to come back on the first comment you made of this question made me think, how exciting is it that this generation's got a much more diverse group of people that it can have as role models? And my children, I coach hockey, so I speak to a lot of 12, 13-year-old girls quite a bit, and they've got such a choice. And when we were 12 or 13, it was Olympic Games. And now they've got a really big choice, and they can come in and start talking about women footballers or women rugby players as well. Yeah, so, and storytelling is going to be, as you sort of mentioned, that has to be the genesis of all of this. The Premier League, for those here old enough to remember when it started, it didn't build on Blackburn Rovers, Leeds United, Manchester United, Liverpool. It didn't build on that. It built on Shearer, it built on Owen, it built on Beckham, right? So that's the way we're going to do it. Certainly, that's the way we're going to build Premiership Women's Rugby. We're a league as well, so I will be trying certainly to build heroes from within the playing base, but also encourage the clubs to do it as well. And I think in rugby, and I'd be interested to hear from people who work in football whether it's the same. There is a little bit of a reluctance to say I am the best player, and I've done sort of media training with some of the England men, who don't like doing media, don't like putting themselves out there, and I always just say to them, just say nice things about other people. Don't worry about yourself. If you don't want to say nice things about yourself. But I think that storytelling, getting to know them, building those profiles is going to be crucial, certainly for us. We have to create people that people have heard of and that people also now as well that can kind of live in their own skin. You know, we've certainly, all sports have horrendous histories of photo shoots and storytelling, which are looked back on with cringe. But now we're starting to see women tell their own stories and portray themselves as they want to. So it's so exciting to be involved in sport at that time, I think.
Emily, as someone who works across the men's and women's team, Edie touched on what, you know, the England have learned on their social media channels and replicating it and the success. How do you navigate sometimes putting out different content? Or I'm sure in the press office there are so many different strategies and also issues that come up. How do you balance trying to really tell the stories across different teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good challenge that probably, if you were asking me this question 5-10 years ago, it probably would have been a completely different answer. I think my role at West Ham is I'm predominantly with the men's team, purely because of the amount of contractual media that we have to deliver in contrast to the women's game. Owing to my background...
Do you wish it was different? Are you kind of sitting there like, guys, give me more women's work?
So I was going to say, so my role is predominantly the men's team, but the women's game is something I'm so passionate about. As a former elite athlete myself, I'm passionate about growing women's sport in general. Obviously, in a previous life, it was hockey and based all on hockey, but now I'm in the football landscape. I will go out my way and I will bang the drum for these women's players, because not only they deserve it in the first instance, but ultimately it's not the support and the exposure that they've had previously. So I guess in my role at the moment, the biggest challenge that we have is kind of managing the contractual stuff that we have to deliver from the men's side of things, but also squeezing every ounce that we can from our women's team. There's just so many incredible stories, as Edie's touched upon. You know, there's so many authentic, untold stories within the women's game at the moment. And that's not just with football, that's across the board. And they haven't been told yet. They haven't been tapped into. And I guess that's in my opinion, the best part of my job is trying to, you know, highlight these success stories and bring them to life.
Do you also think there's a bit more creative freedom in the women's side? For better or worse sometimes, there's a bit more trial and error, but obviously you guys made your own documentary just recently about Dagny Brynjarsdottir, and not many clubs would have sort of gone to try and do just story about one player. So do you think it's quite refreshing, because it sometimes is, if you do want to go and do something, someone will just say, yeah, just go and do it, it's fine?
Yeah, I guess so. And in short, it's one of those where this sort of thing, you know, speaking on Dagny's journey, she's in a unique position. She's currently, you know, a mother of 2 sons, currently in the process of returning to play for the second time in elite sport. It's a story that's kind of unheard of in the elite sporting world. You know, I think back to when I used to play hockey. I always, and probably wrongly, hold my hands up, you know, I always assumed that it'd have to be one or the other. I'd have to be a Great Britain hockey player, or I'd have to make that sacrifice and stop playing hockey and be a mum. You know, I'd never have thought to do the two together alongside each other. And yeah, having the opportunity to work with Dagny since I joined the club, and obviously, you know, share this journey with her. And, you know, she had the full support of the club in terms of when she shared the news that she was expecting her second child. And from my side of things, you know, I'll take myself back 5 years ago. I would have loved to have seen a hockey player doing this. So to be able to highlight that story in the football world and showcase this incredible athlete, not just smashing it on the football pitch, but also, you know, being a mother of 2, it's just incredible and a story that needs to be told.
Paul, kind of as an extension of what Emily's just said there, and that sort of creative opportunity, how hard is it, though, to get sign off and budget for things? Because that's certainly what I feel in women's football and women's sport as a whole. It's, if you can do it on the cheap, good, you know, you can have the sign off. But if you are going and asking for some money to make things, it's sometimes like banging your head against a brick wall. So how do you think in a sport that, you know, maybe there isn't as much money flowing through it as football as well, how do you find the kind of creativity from a financial commercial backing point of view?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complete another panel in itself, isn't it? But the brands haven't really turned up in women's sport yet. They think they have, but they haven't really, because they haven't spent enough money. But I would say that the strategy we've taken is to just do a smaller amount of things, but do them really well. So, within the league, we committed to 3 campaigns this year. One at the start, one when the men's Six Nations had a week off, and then we'll do one at the end of the final. So I think it's working smarter, because you're right, everyone needs more budget. But I think certainly from the rugby players, the wonderful thing that I've found, and I'd be really interested to hear if you say the same from your stars, is that the buy-in is incredible. I worked in men's rugby for a long time. We did a big photo shoot at the start of the season called Power Differently, where we got together a player from each club for a photo shoot and lots of different media. And I as we all do in this room, I was working late, so I sent the emails out to the 10 women that we'd selected at about 10 o'clock at night. One of which was Marley Packer, who's the England captain. Now, because she's England captain, one of our highest profile players, can you imagine how busy he is. 10:02, I remember because the news was still on. Email back, I love this. I really want to be part of it. Another player, Edie Kelly at Harlequins. Yeah, and I've also got a great stylist you could use. Real buy-in. And again, at the shoot, I remember one of the other players, Shauna Brown, said, when someone picks a photograph of me and puts it in a newspaper, I see that as a bit of an honour, right? Now, I don't want to be too humble about this thing, right? Because they don't have to apologise for being there. But I think there's the buy-in, and they want to get involved, and they want to help grow the sport. Obviously, they are growing, so let's hope they're still doing that in 20 years' time. And I know if I'd sent those 10 emails to 10 male rugby players, I may have got one reply asking me what this was. One would have sent it to his agent, and the other 8 would never even have opened it. So the buy-in is fantastic. So working with them, and again, I'd be really interested to hear if the other guys think the same. That is so satisfying, because they want to do it, they want to be creative, they want to grow the sport, and they want to work with you. So we all need more budgets, but when we get there, it's so much better and so much more satisfying for everyone involved, is the answer probably.
Edie, do you find that with the players that you work with? I remember obviously seeing you at like WSL Media Days, pre-season, getting content. Do you find that as well? It's like there's a different culture and environment that also makes storytelling sometimes that much easier.
Yeah, and I think that the budget question's kind of a weird one, because wherever you are, you always want more budget, right? And whatever job you do, there's never enough budget, even if you've got 10 million or £10. So there's always going to have to be workarounds, and I think you've seen it firsthand. We're turning up to media days. We've got a table that we've just thrown a tablecloth on. We've got a phone up, and there's a ring light around. Like, that's not high quality value, but we're getting millions of views on it. So I don't think budget necessarily results in numbers and good views and a good engagement. And I think that's where understanding your platforms, especially social platforms, comes into play, because you can do different things to get the best results. It doesn't mean if you've got 50 grand, that translates to the results.
Well,
Millie Bright didn't need any money to do the TikTok dances, did she?
Not at all.
Which brought in a whole new group of people. And actually, I'll be honest, because I just came on my For You, they got me a bit more interested in women's football as well. So that was just a hotel room.
Well, I was going to ask about TikTok specifically, because it's such a fast-moving platform. So how do you guys react based on what people in the comments are saying about what they want? Like, how do you almost curate and build your strategy of content? Is it just doing something and then seeing what works, or is it about listening to fans and saying, oh, they really want this or like this? How do you work it out?
I think you're probably a bit more into this, because you'll get a lot of more access with the players, because we have set times with them. We kind of just have to do stuff that's evergreen. But it tends to be like that. We know what the fans want, and we dig into it a bit. But if we did have the day-to-day, I think it would very much be that, and see what they're up for, really.
Yeah, I think, from a club perspective, I think even in I've been at West Ham for just under 3 years now, and, the dynamic and the landscape around the power of social media, for example, is just only going in one direction. And the power of social media, we've now, in terms of social media accounts, we've not just got our UK account, we've got a Brazilian account now, we've got, multiple accounts across the world, and kind of that highlights the power of sport and football. And in my opinion, I think it's only going to go in one direction.
Emily, also your experience playing hockey at elite level, sometimes I do feel like women's football and women's sport in general, I think, rugby's had this, especially Olympics games have this, they struggle to push beyond that major event audience. And I feel like you would know that so much. Think about Rio gold for GB hockey in 2016, right? And I think about England netball, Commonwealth Games gold, is those sports have really struggled to push beyond grassroots and Olympic moments or Commonwealth Games moments. Football, because of its cultural currency, it feels like it can navigate that a bit more. But I think with still a women's sport, it's so hard for them to break through beyond these major event peaks. In your experience, what would be the learnings where you could say, I feel like this might be the opportunity to achieve that? It's obviously not easy.
Yeah, what a question. If I'm being completely honest as well, it was something that bugbear is probably a little bit too strong, but I was really lucky to join the Great Britain Hockey Centralised programme off the back of Rio. So arguably the biggest, spotlight on our sport that we've ever had. The girls were incredible in Rio. Hoping some of you guys managed to share that famous night where we beat Holland, world #1, on a penalty shootout. And the BBC News at 10 got delayed, and hockey was in the forefront of everyone's minds. And being an athlete joining that environment at the peak, you're kind of thinking, well, what more can be done? How can we continue to build this momentum and grow our game? And I was lucky to be involved for nearly 5 years, and throughout my career it was always a case of, could there be more to be done? And as you've said, hockey being an Olympic sport, it peaks throughout a 4-year cycle, right? So you have a Commonwealth Games midway through that 4-year Olympic cycle. You have a World Cup every two, in the middle of those 4 years, a European Championships that fall either side. And I guess that is the biggest challenge for sports such as, hockey, netball. Is kind of how can you prolong the coverage and the exposure all year round? And I think that's a luxury that football has, and I'm kind of seeing the other side of that now in my current role. But looking back, I think I don't have the answers, and I appreciate it's far easier said than done, but it is kind of how can you tap into that a little bit more?
Well, what I want to ask as well is, a lot of women's football teams have a really die-hard fan base, and it differs a lot across the league, right? So even Chelsea, the most successful team right now in the league, back-to-back titles, we're still struggling to fill Stamford Bridge. Kingsmeadow, really strong 4,000 plus attendances, but really struggling to fill Stamford Bridge. So how have West Ham worked out, there's such a big men's team fan base. How do we tap in and pull those people across?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because as well, every club is in a unique situation. So, we were talking earlier at how you see Arsenal. I think they are the A-star at the moment. They are, the setting the standards when it comes to, selling out the Emirates and going above and beyond for their women's team. And I think other clubs are following. And it's kind of seeing from a West Ham perspective, I think we're not hiding behind the fact that it's very much, we're on this journey that we're evolving the women's team. I think it's a big statement from the club that they introduced a specific women's board this time last year. Karen Brady kind of heads that up with 3 other executive directors, all a female. Rhiann Skinner coming in at the start of the season, the club's first female manager. It's stuff like that kind of is growing that identity around. We know what West Ham is all about. We know the identity. We're very proud of our East London roots, and that's coming from an East Londoner herself. But it's how we kind of grow that women's brand in its own entity. I look back on my childhood. I would have loved to have grown up in a community where West Ham had a women's team, but that wasn't the case. And now it's kind of, it is in place, and it's how we can grow that and maximise it. And as you touch upon, it's kind of really giving that kind of the exposure that it deserves.
Yeah, I think I was just going to add that I think it's really tough to assume that a club like Chelsea, who can sell out Stamford Bridge on a Premier League match, can do the equivalent for a women's league, because we're looking into fans at the minute, and I think it's a bit more complex than just saying you're a Chelsea fan, so you're a Chelsea fan. And we're actually finding that there's new fans, so there's no such thing as a purist, really, because I'm a Chelsea fan. I grew up as like a 4th generation Chelsea fan. I don't necessarily think that's the same in women's football. So it's going to be interesting to see, as the audience grows, what that's going to look like and who the fans actually are.
A new definition of legacy fan. I like it. We'll put the purist in instead. We've had a couple of questions around access to data, and I think, Paul, that's a challenge I found the times that I have covered women's rugby, covering, Harlequins women's games, is I think the data access in women's football's got so much better, especially WSL. The data that, it's easy to access, there's a lot of data points. Women's rugby, trying to just find out some of the basic information can be really difficult. So do you think that's still a massive gap as well? Because it's hard then to tell those certain stories when you can't access necessarily the data.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're still a very young sport, and probably one of my jobs is to open that data up to more and more people, and I use that. I use it every week to tell the stories. And even when I speak to all the media managers on a Tuesday, and even if they've lost 15-0, I'll send them and go, I bet you can find a couple of gems in here, because that's the way we go. In a sense, it's a really just a great access point to be able to say, that May Campbell at Saracens is brilliant. We can just say that, but now we can show it. So it is really important for us, because May's a great example. She won't be well known. It's all very well to say, to say that Garnacho is a great player. Well, that's fine. And the stats kind of are not relevant, but they're not as relevant, but they're really relevant for someone like May Campbell, who plays at Saracens. I don't know why I've picked her, but I have anyway. So for me, they're really important. And I guess one of my jobs, and it was funny, this morning, I spent quite a bit of time sending our stats to the people who I knew were commentating and writing about the Women's Six Nations, to try and make that link for them, because I want them to talk about how performances at Saracens or Harlequins or Sale Sharks or Leicester Tigers have led to those people being in the Women's Six Nations, to make that link to international rugby. So you're right, we're new and we're growing, and we need to get data into more people's hands, because it's just a brilliant access point for them. And also, as I'm sure has been said a lot today, young people particularly really love it.
Well, also on that kind of conversation we had earlier about major events, there is a home Women's Rugby World Cup on the horizon next year. I feel like not a lot of people, or maybe not enough people, have been speaking about it. And because, football is so much part of the natural conversation and culture, is it frustrating maybe that there isn't quite the same fanfare around this that there maybe was for the Women's Euros? Or are you hoping that you guys can tap in and galvanise that same crowd that followed the Lionesses?
Yeah, definitely that's the objective. As a league, it's a generational opportunity for us. Having the Women's World Cup here in England is a generational opportunity, and we've got to, because in a sense, the circus comes to town at World Cup or whatever, and then it leaves, and the Olympics a bit like that. You've got to keep on the wave, and that for us is our single biggest strategic challenge in the next 12 months, to be able to keep going on that wave without question. And I think the lovely thing is, of course, every sport now, I think probably male and female, wants their Lionesses moment, right? Which is incredible that we're talking about something that a women's sport created now that everyone wants, and yet we absolutely want our Lionesses moment, and then we want it to run into the league as well. So yeah, it's a huge opportunity, and one we have to capitalise. Many tournaments that have come to, certainly to England or to the UK, governing bodies or sports have just seen them seen it go past them. Fantastically, football didn't allow that to happen. It created the Lioness moment, then it grabbed onto it with all its might and wouldn't let go and kept it going. And we still talk about it, don't we? So football did an amazing job, I think, keeping hold of the Lionesses moment, and we absolutely want that.
Do you think there's enough kind of cross-party sharing of information? Like, obviously, I know you're not part of the organising committee, but do you find there's an opportunity to say to stakeholders within the women's football landscape, hey, we really want to know how you guys followed that up, whether it's obviously speaking to clubs or whoever? Do you think there's enough opportunity? Do you think people are a bit more in isolation?
Not in women's sport, I don't think. I think, in male sport, the barriers go up a little bit more. Although I must admit, when I worked in Premiership Rugby, the other sports were great, and I had a fantastic relationship with the people at the Premier League. So, but I think in women's sport, rugby's done a great job of fighting with itself, shooting itself in the foot over the last 30 years since it went professional. unity and collaboration has to be the future. And if you need to argue, do that, but do it behind closed doors. Please never see club v country as a headline in the newspaper. We have to collaborate, so across sports too. And that is done. That is done to an extent as well. And we will collaborate hugely with the people running Women's World Cup, because that's the way forward together. There's no chance of going forward if you're apart and arguing, certainly in public, I don't think.
Emily, someone's asked from a club perspective, what are the key things / data points on the women's game that people should be presenting? So within their digital channels or their digital products, maybe it's, email marketing to fans. Have you got any examples of things that you guys have included in order to try and pull in fans or followers or get that interest?
I think the biggest thing, and Edie touched upon it earlier, in terms of seeing these, players as, they're people, they've got personalities, they're all unique, they've got incredible backstories. And a big part for us at West Ham is trying to really, pull on the heartstrings of the fans and kind of build that relationship so that they're kind of associated with these players that previously they wouldn't have come across. And I think that's the biggest kind of difference between, the men's game and the women's game. We can see it in the men's game, that they've been on the TV, for years. And I think of, the match stickers and stuff like that. The women's football stickers now are a thing, and children in schools now are able to do the swapsies that we used to do when we were younger. And it's kind of having those kind of relationships with the players on a more personable format. And I think that's the biggest thing that we can kind of drive through our channels, whether that's marketing, whether that's through social media, and it's kind of untap that a little bit more than what we have done in the past.
Yeah, Edie, I wanted to ask you, sort of on the back of that, when you're looking at your audience, we obviously talked about TikTok and that short form content and how you guys really utilize that. But in terms of understanding your audience, it is such a fast moving growth sport, so it's quite hard to sometimes keep up with understanding the age demographic, the gender makeup, because we've always been living in a space where the reality was that actually more men watched women's sport than women. But I feel like the next generation will be challenging that metric massively. So for the NUCO, it's a really exciting era, but obviously a key part of that is we've got to understand our audience, and then we've got to expand that audience. So how do you kind of see the women's football audience right now? Where does it sit? Is it, millennials, Gen Z? Is it we're going after more younger men? Like, how do you see that makeup of the audience?
It's something that we're digging into a lot. As you say, like, the foundations need to be there before we start pushing out marketing to masses, because we need to understand who's watching what where. And I think what we are seeing is that new fan, is that people are a new fan to sport in general. So they might not have followed football or anything before, but they've seen the West Ham documentary and thought, that's something I want to get into. Who is that? I'm going to go to the game. I'm going to watch and go through that way. We're in early stages of that, so I can't say too much, but you think, like, this weekend we broke the attendance record, and it's the biggest watch season ever, and that happened last year, and it happened the year before, and it's probably going to happen next year. So that's 100,000 new people attending these games, and next year it's going to probably be double that, or more and more. So we just need to keep on top of it and be aware that it is a changing dynamic, and it's something that we need to just continue to look at and not rest on the laurels that they are a club supporter and they support that club, and that is the bottom line, because that's not the case.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, Paul, do you maybe sometimes find that harder with rugby because it is seen as more of a traditional audience? But do you think with women's rugby there's actually more of an exciting opportunity, especially with, I think about the new Red Roses social media channel? Like, when you look at the content that the Red Roses put out, it feels different, it feels more relevant. And do you think that they've kind of realised that and think actually we can pull in a whole new audience that aren't rugby fans?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we could, as you can imagine, we were involved in supporting the launch of those new channels this week. And what I've really loved about them, and anyone here who hasn't looked at them should give the Red Roses a follow on Instagram, is that the women athletes are portraying themselves as they want to be portrayed. As I was saying earlier, there's been horrendous examples of media 10, 20, 30 years ago with women's sport, but they're showing, Titania Hurd and Ellie Kelly are showing themselves as they want to be shown, and I think that's fantastic. So they're taking real ownership of those channels and deciding how they want to be portrayed on them. So I think that is a really, really significant thing. I think the other part of it within women's rugby is that young girls and women are saving rugby from participation level. This is now globally. We would see a huge decline in participation if it wasn't for girls and women. And probably football doesn't have that issue. It's probably just everyone plays anyway. So we have got this brand new audience, because a lot of people that watch or are involved in rugby probably have played. So the more we can get to play, the more we can get to enjoy it, understand it, want to get involved in it. So I think that's quite exciting for us, that there is a genuine new generation of players that are really enjoying the sport and hopefully will be committed to it for a long time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One last sort of big question, then we'll do some more audience questions, but it's maybe the controversial one. Sometimes I think it is frustrating in the space of women's sport because there is such a focus on good news stories and those headlines and those records being broken. But when we talk about building habits, building audiences, and getting outside of that maybe sort of major event churn, sometimes I certainly feel frustrated where I feel like we miss the truth beneath, which when I think about maybe the WSL for some teams now, but certainly a few years ago, where lots of players weren't on great salaries and the working conditions weren't great. And obviously in women's rugby right now, only a few across the league are privileged enough to have full-time professional contracts. So do you guys sort of agree with me in that you would think sometimes we do need to be truthful in how we reflect on the realities of the sport, whether that's the attendances or the finances or just the realities of being a female athlete in today's world? Or do you think it is important to be positive because that might, help attract those brands and partnerships and audiences? It is a very hard question, so I'm not, hopefully not setting up anyone to fail, but Paul, I feel like you're ready.
Yeah, that's right. That's fine. And I think something Edie mentioned earlier about getting a base for your, for your marketing. You need to do a lot of research to do that, and I think it is important to be really truthful. Because then we will create a realistic base. There's no point saying, there's no point trying to spin it and saying there's 10 times as many people come into games as there are, because that doesn't give you a realistic starting point. Yeah, and of course, rugby itself, we are a growing sport, only been professional for a couple of decades, and therefore we do need to be financially sustainable as well. So we are selling a bit of a dream, but we've got a great partnership with the RFU, which is helping us with that. I think that's another way, you can go with governing bodies, and they now, we're very obvious and public about that partnership and how positive it is. And certainly within our league, we've got, Scotland got a 32-player squad and we got 29 of them, and, 3/4 of the Welsh team. So the unions are coming to the table a little bit with those contracts. So that can help, that partnership. And obviously the RFU are contracting Red Roses, and they're getting paid. We'd all want them to get paid more. That's why we've just started. That's why we're in a 10-year strategy to grow the game. And we want to get on that road to professionalism. Of course, the women involved are very, quite rightly, impatient to go fast. We just need to go at a pace we know that's sustainable. That's really important, I think.
I think sustainability is the $1 million question in women's sport, right? And women's football is having that whole debate right now.
Yeah, I mean, all I was thinking as you were asking that question, I just took myself back to my hockey days, and impatient came to my head. As an athlete, I was so impatient of what more can be done? What more can we do to grow our sport? What more can be done to, give more children the opportunity to pick up a hockey stick, no matter what their background is? I'm impatient in my role at the moment because I see, and that is why, you've got to be so unapologetically demanding of the sporting landscape. And ultimately, it's a good thing. I see myself as quite a positive person. I'm a glass half full person. I see the, good in every situation. But ultimately, I think sport, there's always been a difference in terms of equality, whether that be opportunity, whether that be through gender, across the board. And I think that's kind of the biggest challenge that you have to face. And as you touched upon, sometimes it's those sort of stories that don't necessarily get spoken about. Female footballers not having their own boot contracts, for example, having to pay for their own kit, or not having the same opportunities as the male counterparts. I think that's kind of, a reflection of, in my opinion, society, and kind of just changing those stereotypes that have been, historical throughout time. But yeah, impatience probably a word that kind of resonates with me, but I'm confident that with time, especially, when we're talking about women's football and the rise and the upward trajectory we've seen since that famous Lionesses victory in the Euros, I think is definitely going in the right direction.
Hey, some of the biggest changes in women's football have come from people being impatient and banging on the door and demanding more rights. So it's very important. Edie, how about you?
I think probably sitting in a more privileged position in a women's football aspect, because it's not really a sub-story for us. At the top leagues, we are on the biggest stages in front of, broadcast deals. We've got Sky Sports, we've got BBC. Like, people want us. And I don't think that we should be necessarily focusing on the bad stories, because while there is an area to do that, we have a brilliant product that people want to see. So that's the story. These players are incredible players, and they are extremely talented, and there's your story. And watch them every week on Sky Sports or on BBC, or watch them as they've, doing these massive ads for these big brands. And I think that's the story. These are superstars, and we are building heroes. So perhaps in a more privileged position, but from a league perspective, especially WSL, it's a really great product.
We've had a question which I suppose is a bit of an open call, really, but what do you guys think the media could do to help build those women's sport heroes, and maybe leaning on your own sports? Obviously, Paul, you've been on the media side, you've been on the comms side, so what are some of the things that you would maybe wish for the media to support with and maybe play their part a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd love all the media to be a little bit more story driven. I must admit, 'cause when I will pick up my newspaper or go onto my website, those are the things I really like. I don't, it's a very news driven agenda, right? In the last, I'd say, few decades, that 24-hour news cycle has created they're very news hungry platforms. So I would love them to tell more stories, because I know that when I pick up my, as I say, my media, that's the bit I'm interested in. I'm interested in the documentary. I'm not necessarily interested in today's news about, those that it's the people. I'm always very people driven. So if I could hope for one thing, it would be more great features on great athletes, be they men or women, in those pages. And of course, the media has changed quite a lot in the last decade. People are, that there is a lot more women's sport, and that we all love. And the Telegraph women's supplement came out yesterday, which I'm sure we all enjoyed. But we want to. That's what I'd probably love to see: more stories getting told about the athletes themselves, and really getting to the root of who they are and why they're there. Because there are some great stories to be told.
Emily, how about you? As someone who's interacting with the media every day.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can say it from my side of things. The media have done so much in terms of helping to grow the women's game, and I think that shouldn't be taken for granted. I think it's not necessarily. I see the contrast of the women's pool of journalists that are working relentlessly to try and grow the game, and then you've got the contrast of the numbers on the men's side of the spectrum. It's just polar opposites, right? But just to follow on from Paul's point, I mean, the biggest part of my job is kind of, I love telling those stories and helping our players kind of feel supported in that. I think back to the last few weeks. Last week, Mikel Antonio did some contractual media, and we went back to his primary school in Earlsfield, and then we went on to his first football club, Tooting and Mitcham, and kind of Mikel's journey to the Premier League stardom and ultimately being a European champion last season. It's not been necessarily the most straightforward of journeys, and sometimes I look as a football fan, but also on the flip side, as having this close working relationship with him, sometimes you don't quite appreciate the journeys that these athletes have been on and their backstories, and the reason why they're so, passionate about what they do. And kind of, Mikel's a type of person that wears his heart on his sleeve, and you kind of see that through his backstory. And so just following on from Paul's point, I mean, that's the big part for me. It's kind of really unpicking those stories that haven't been told and really kind of celebrating those.
Yeah, I think even to add on that point is like different publications, I think, is a really interesting point for women's football. I would like to see it done a bit differently, not necessarily in your mainstream media, but there are brilliant personalities, you know, whether that's going to the last shot with Tooney and then seeing her score bangers on the weekend. Like those stories, I think there's a huge market for people who haven't necessarily thought about football and women's football before to dig deeper into that, you know, Stylist magazine, all of those areas that have a massive gap because these athletes now are sought after and people want to hear that. And in a different way, that's just traditionally the kind of football lens.
Well, guys, that is our time. So thank you so much for sharing your insight, and thanks to everyone who stayed to watch this one and also sent in your questions. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you as well.